Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 153, Design Deconstruction, the Garden Guerilla Patches. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the show. Happy to have you guys in. Happy to have you in on this Education Friday, where we're going to discuss some stuff and enjoy a little bit of a down kind of weekend. You know, we're coming up into a weekend, which is a holiday weekend in the US, and I know a lot of people are kind of checked out, and I wanted to make this an easy, fun, breezy, kind of simple episode where we do a little design deconstruction. We start to kind of back down some of the excess stuff and get into just some fun deconstruction. And a lot of people have said, we like the analysis shows, we like you walking through designs, we like walking through the inspiration with you, and we want to talk about that stuff. So for those of you who like the deconstruction, for those of you who have not already checked out on this Friday for the weekend, we're going to talk about patches and all manner of patches. You guys might have seen me playing around with one of my patches on earlier shows today. I've got this wonderful conversation heart patch that I did, and I made the joke that I always do, the half joking comment that embroidery lets us wear our hearts quite literally on our sleeves. Well, in this case, that's part of what we're talking about here. What do we do with decorated apparel, with embroidery, with printing, with any of these things? We help people express themselves, show their affiliations, show to which groups they belong, what things they believe in. And I think in that case, really, it is worthwhile for us to think about what we do in that vein, that we're making these things that help people to express themselves, to help them express causes that they're interested in, to help them create and express themselves in general. And in that case, I thought, what would be a better way to kind of get through some of that stuff, show some inspiration, have some fun, than to go through some of my original patch designs that people have asked me about. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is the original version of these were made as patch style designs. Pardon my flipped collar here. It's running in hot today, as you can tell from being late. But patch style designs were the original kind of thought for these. These were designs that were not meant to be patches themselves, but to be direct embroidery patch style designs. And in truth, that's where we started. And we'll talk about that. But you can convert a patch style design to a real patch fairly easily. Moreover, you can convert to different types of patches and different types of patch production methods pretty easily. And I think we'll get into a little bit of all of that, as well as allow this to be a really easy, free place for you folks to talk about things, to ask questions, and to just enjoy a Friday together on this. Like I said, a pre-holiday Friday where I know that traffic's down and people are kind of already getting into the spirit of being off for the day in a lot of the US right now. And I know I got a lot of folks who are not from the US. For all of you wonderful people who are already into the weekend overseas and beyond, I would love to say thank you for being here. And I cannot wait to get into this with you folks. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on. Let's see who's here. I like to always say hi to the folks who are live, so you know, hey, even if you're in hashtag replay squad, checking this out over your weekend or later, happy to have you in. Please still ask questions in the comments. I don't always get to all the questions, but I try to. And many of you who have been here for a while know sometimes those questions you ask, even if I don't have a chance to answer you explicitly directly, will become the inspiration for future shows where you sometimes get an entire hour of me answering your questions. So be sure to pester me when you have a real question, and I will absolutely get into it with you. But let's say hi to the people who are here. Like I said, you're in the replay squad, go ahead and skip. Nobody will be hurt. But while people are here, I like to have that interaction. This is part of how we keep together as a community. So first, get Gail coming in saying, good afternoon, everyone. Kingsbury Crafts, thank you for being in. We have Barb from Minnesota Custom Made saying good afternoon from North Central Minnesota. Hi, Eric. Hi, Barb. Happy to have you in. We've got Frank coming in from over in the UK. Wonderful community sharer and host of his own groups. Frank, doing great stuff. And from both accounts, thank you much, man. Thanks for the views. Thank you for logging in, my friend. We got Rich coming in saying, hi, Eric. Hi, Rich. Happy to see you in here, too. Awesome to have you here. And I love to see you guys talking with you guys, with each other in this community. We are reciprocators. We give back. And I love to see that stuff. So lovely, lovely stuff to have you here. Also, Juan Carlos, happy to see you're here. Checked out the Embroidered software package. Yeah, go check it out. We'll have support. So there's support on the website. It says contact us up at the top. You want to check things out or ask questions, go ahead and ask questions via email there, and you will get a ticket. Support people are there for you. And I know other softwares have that too. We have a wonderful support team that works quite a lot of hours, sometimes more than they're contracted for. I'm sure they get out there and they like to answer these questions, and they're serious about their work, so they like to show up and help. Scott from Sunrise Tactical Gear saying happy Friday. Yes, happy Friday. Though, as you know, many business owners and myself included, Friday doesn't always mean a whole lot, does it, folks? We have the freedom to work any hours we want, any 18 out of the 24 any given day. But we work a lot. We like to get things done. And I love to see you guys talking to each other. Awesome. And also, Juan Carlos from Miami, welcome. Happy to have you in. Didn't know. And everybody's saying hi to each other. Awesome. We are in. We are here. Anyone who shows up later, please, hey, bring your friends. Tell them there's stuff going on here if you want to talk about it. Otherwise, I say this and I never make it happen, but I was intending for this to be a shorter show. We'll see if it's short or not. I'm going to ramble a little bit about some patch designs, talk about some tools, talk about some techniques. And as I get into it, as I discuss this stuff, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to give your insights. You decorators out there in the field doing the work are the ones who are not only motivating me to be here, but who have that information and who are there sharing with each other and who are facing the challenges day to day. So I want to have your input as well. But to start this all out, the first thing I wanted to do is just introduce you to the patch designs I'm talking about. If you guys have been around for a while and you know my very, very much non-updated site with my stock designs. I don't update that site very much at all. I've got a few things queued on to go up there, but it just hasn't been a priority for my stock design site to have that stuff up there. I'm just going to say, I will put it up there for you guys to see. If you want to go to my website that has some stock designs on it, the onlystitch.com is where it is. I'm going to go ahead and add a banner now because I didn't even think to do it ahead of time. Onlystitch.com is where this stuff is. If you want to purchase copies of the initial designs I'm talking about, these are not patch setups. They are not patch setups. These are currently the direct embroidery versions of these designs, which is where this all started. These started as a direct embroidery take on patches, and then it became the impetus for me to first start making patches for myself. And those patches led to all the patches you guys have seen me do. Now, certainly a lot of it was people come to us saying, can you do it? But where I got my experimentation solidified, for me at least, where I could really start to teach it to people and get them working on smaller end patches, was partially at least driven on more by what we do here, more by this kind of self-directed work. And here's the thing I'm going to say about this. And, take off this onlystitch.com thing. I'm just going to say, in general, when we're doing projects, I want you to know that there is nothing so valuable as some self-directed work if you have the time and the ability. Now, not everybody has the time to do a lot of this stuff. I think taking the time to play, even if it sometimes takes a little bit away from your daily production, is very, very valuable for education. So take some time to stitch something you like. In this case, I was scratching my own itch and I refined my patch process quite a lot through this. And in refining that process, I went from banging out patches because I had to randomly, to having a directed process I could teach and I could get people on board with making their own small run patches at a time where for most of the embroidery shops I talked to when I first started making patches, it was a rarity to do it in-house. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Don't get me wrong. There are massive emblem houses who've been doing it forever. Think of AB Emblem, who was making the original NASA patches and is still making this stuff for just about every spacefaring agency you can imagine. These folks have been doing it on Shifley machines forever. They know how to cut these things out. They run them in big spans, and that's what they've been doing forever. But especially back in my early days as an embroiderer, patch companies had high minimums. And if you couldn't make that minimum order for a set of patches, really, it wasn't a thing to be able to outsource them the way it is now. Admittedly, lower minimums are out there. You can outsource a lot. But what I see now are people wanting to make patches because they want to have more creative control. So for those of you who want that creative control, who are boutique patch makers, maybe you're making your own line of patches, this kind of effort, the kind of stuff I'm talking about today, is more probably up your alley than someone who's doing mass patch production, because there is a line at which we start looking at mass production instead of doing them in-house. Though, as I can say from lots of the folks I know in the industry, you can absolutely do what I usually would have considered an outsourced size job when we're getting past the 100 mark now these days. Used to be up into the 500 mark for some of these things, depending on what era we're talking about. But there are people making those at home regularly now, or making those in their home, in their home shops. And I don't necessarily mean home-based shops, but yes, home-based shops, but making those in their own shops, taking it home, taking it to their direct in-house production. So there are people doing it, but what I really love is this sweet spot of someone who's got a great idea for patches. They want to use these for something, but they aren't going to get those minimums. They're not going to get 25 sometimes even. They're going to get a small number of pieces. They're not going to get 100 pieces. And they need to have that fulfillment done. Or someone who is making something artistic, something creative, something different, and they want to have some of that creative control, or they're making their own line. They're going to have more of the same feelings that I did when I was making these pieces. Now, once again, I was working in a mid-sized shop. When I did these specific pieces, I was scratching my own itch and I was teaching myself something, learning some things, and working on style. The original set that I did for these was before I was making a ton of patches, and I did them just to work on inspiration and style and get some of the kind of classic patch ethos going. So we're going to talk about that, right? So really a cool concept, something that, like I said, I've been fighting for patches for so long as a small home run thing, as a single head shop possibility, even as something that could be done small run in mid-sized shops instead of necessarily having to book them out or buy extra or whatever it is that we had to do. And we've done all manner of things. All of those are viable options. And it's cool to see that now it is a popular concept. It's made the rounds, and then projects and products like we have at Embrilliance Merrily, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to talk about that a little later, have made it even more accessible to people. Is just awesome. The democratization of embroidered patches as a way to express yourself couldn't make me happier. Seriously, it's something that I've been wanting forever. I remember talking about the patch trend, and I think the first article I wrote on the patch trend as it was starting to be done in-house, the small run patches that I was fighting for 8 to 10 years ago. So that trend has absolutely just continued and run right out into today. So a couple more people talking about stuff. So cool stuff going on. We've got, yeah, working Friday for me. Keep both machines stitching. Absolutely. I'm going to grab a couple people here also. Lisa saying, hi, Eric. Yes, boutique and small quantity is very popular. Absolutely. Brian Bailey, creator of Brilliance, and who did incredible work to make Merrily, which I'll talk about later, with its automations, which is part of what I'm going to discuss toward the end of this in the technique section. He says, I'm here for a change. No school rest till August. Awesome. Glad to see you here. And Brian, a brilliant human being who has helped to, once again, advance this democratization of being able to make patches for yourself, which I love. So whether you're at home, whether you're a crafter, whether you're a boutique patch maker, you're making your own line of cool patches that you're selling direct, or like me, you're somebody commercial who's making patches for an industrial purpose, or like me, again, you're scratching your own itch and making something creative. We now have tools that just make this easier and easier and allow you to have really great finished edges. But let me introduce you to the designs that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to break some down, talk about them a little bit, discuss my inspirations. And like I said, shorter show, lighter show, because I know it's people are already kind of checked out. Enjoy this one. Have fun. You're a visual thinker. You'll be able to see some stuff and check it out. Let's go ahead and add to the stream our original setup of designs. Now, these are over here at theonlystitch.com. That's on my website, but these are the original designs that we're talking about. The Garden Guerilla patch embroidery design. This is the first one that started it all. So as you can see, we've got a double top and bottom rocker set on a shoulder patch. So this is very much, it's idiosyncratic. We've got some interesting things as far as the shaping here. We've got that terracotta pot. We've got very classic kind of military wings on this trowel. So this is definitely kind of an odd little mix-up, right? I'll talk about guerrilla gardening in a minute and discuss it, but these are the three patches in the trio. Garden Guerilla patch, number one. Number two is the Harvest Heroes patch, is probably the one most of you have seen the most of, because this is one of the ones where I turned it into a full-fledged patch design and taught this in a bunch of my classes, right? So really cool ways to work with that as well. And then on top of that one, we have one of my favorites, actually, though I know it's probably the most controversial because the wording makes it a little weird, the Seed Bomber patch. And this one has a lovely little rendition of a seed bomb, and we'll talk about what those are in a moment. But I rendered it as an old school type of cartoon bomb, and one of the reasons I like this one the best is because I sketched this out, and unfortunately, I couldn't find the sketch for today. I had it laid out and forgot to take pictures of this thing before I got onto the air today. But I sketched this one out literally on a Post-it note and then did a very light amount of vector and then did all of the shading and kind of fun work that's in here that I'll show you in a minute in the embroidery software directly when I was making these original pieces. So these are the ones we're going to talk about. There's other things to discuss, but before I get too far along, what I wanted to show you was the concept of guerrilla gardening. If you look at guerrillagardening.org here, and by the way, the difference between the spellings on Guerilla or Guerilla on this one. This is probably the more appropriate with two R's. I'm using the single R because when I first did this, I looked up a variant spelling. When I first did it, I had a variant spelling with the single R. It's actually shown as a variant spelling, even if you check this out in any sort of spell checking. Generally, you're going to have a variant spelling with one R, but probably more correct before anybody says it with the two R's. Absolutely, that's the case. I'm not gonna fib and say it's not, but it is a variant spelling that I looked up, and I just accidentally chose the one that was a little more rare. It was something that I think was more common in British circles, and where I was looking this stuff up from and where I got excited about it was looking at a British news story, honestly, about guerrilla gardening. So before I go any further with it, I'm just going to tell you what guerrilla gardening is. Don't think of it as something that actually sounds scary. I know guerrilla can be a scary word here, but the constant here is to think about people improving spaces, whether or not it's necessarily an approved space for them to plant in. So what guerrilla gardening is, in a nutshell, is people taking over spaces, public spaces that are derelict, public fields that are not dealt with correctly. Maybe you have a median that somebody attempted to garden in, but they're not watering it. The city's not taking care of it. And you decide to get native plants that work well, to do the work yourself, to work on a community plot, to add seeds that are of native plants that are beneficial to pollinators, things like that, in these open areas, in these dead planters, in overlooked spaces that don't look nice, so that in urban locations or wherever you are that you've got a nasty vacant lot, you now have a nicely manicured or otherwise beneficial plot of plants. And as a younger dude, I really liked the concept of it. And especially, I thought as a design concept, I really got excited about this concept that, hey, we have the concept of what a guerrilla is. We have a concept of gardening and plants. And then it made me think, all right, so if we're getting this mental kind of vision of somebody who's doing some paramilitary thing plus someone who's doing gardening, plants, stuff like that, I was like, man, what's the right call for this? As a design ethos, I'm like, oh, patches. Absolutely. We have to do like uniform patches, but uniform patches that refer to this gardening project. And the other thing I'm going to show you, if I can show you kind of further down here, and I have to see if we've got this here. I had it pulled up earlier and had a crash that kind of lost some of my tabs. But if we see here, seed bombing the Tate, we see right here where this guy has a slingshot. What is in his hand that you can't see is a little packet of soil that already has seeds in it. And it's a way where folks, if they can't get to a location, but let's say we have an empty lot that's fully fenced in, but it's looking ugly, looking derelict, and nothing's in there but weeds, we can put beneficial plant seeds, beneficial flower seeds, and fire them into that empty lot, that empty space. And then when it rains, when there's natural water, especially if they're native plants that are good for that region that you're in, they'll pop up and grow from those little seed bombs. So seed bombs generally not using a slingshot. Most of the time, people are just hucking a little ball of nicely put together soil with seeds inside. Very much like if you've ever seen seed paper, people now do these envelopes or greeting cards that have seed paper inside of them. It's paper that has seeds inside of that mesh where you can lay that paper down and then they sprout later on. This is a way to get seeds to a place that it's hard to get to by being able to chuck them, throw them, or shoot them around. So without discussing the relative ethics of seed bombing or guerrilla gardening, understand that I had this thought in my head. I'm like, man, that sounds kind of cool. Also, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We often have some derelict spaces that are in the city that I thought would look a lot nicer if the people in the local community right around them could plant some nice flowers, could take care of them, or put native flowers, native plants in that don't take a lot of extra care, so that when, like you say, when somebody has demolished an area, we've got planters laying around and they aren't getting watered anymore, that rainwater would be enough to make something nice for the community. So like I said, something interesting. Sorry, guys. Something interesting that is worthwhile, and definitely I think this is not the worst thing anybody has ever done. So I don't think that it's a hateful thing to do, but like I said, the patch designs that came out of that's our Seed Bomber, our Harvest Heroes, and our original Guerrilla Gardening patch. Those were all based out of that thought, based out of that kind of ethos. So to start out, that's the first thing I was thinking about. I was looking at the concept of a guerrilla gardening and thinking, what is it that I could do to make something interesting out of that? What is it that I could do to create a uniform patch, something that looks like it would belong on a piece of military gear on somebody's BDUs, but also had that feeling of that gardening. So, like I said, something weird, maybe not something everybody would do, but I wanted to make some self-directed patch projects, and so that's what I went for. So as you can see, and I'll actually bring up one of the designs and we can talk about it for a second. First thing, as we can see, the first thing I actually ended up with, or the final thing I ended up with, was the kind of 3-patch set I showed you earlier. And we can grab that in the design file as well. Just take a look at it. If we bring that up, here's the file as it finally got done. This is the Garden Guerilla patch. Like I said, don't come at me for the for the single R in there. I know it's wrong. But suffice it to say, that's the Garden Guerilla patch as it finally ended up, with a double rocker set. And we can see that I went ahead with this concept because the central patch shape had a kind of strange void, this kind of between these two curves. I thought, I loved the idea of using a terracotta pot. So these are the things that I was thinking. What am I going to look at? I want something that looks like militaria, that would go on a uniform, that has a color scheme that's kind of similar to, in this case, similar to kind of a subdued color scheme, but also has some colors that are related to gardening. We have that green in there, but has this military flair. And certainly these wings in this case are based on kind of that military flair. So where did I come up with the stuff? Where did I get my inspirations? The truth of the matter is, I looked around. I did what I often call, retail research, which is looking at things that are out there in the world. Usually, retail research is about R&D or retail research. Retail research is for looking at things that are actually in shops on the high street and saying, how do we get some inspiration from that? So I looked for inspirational materials. I know that I want to look for some militaria, and I'm going to be looking at through that stuff with the concept of what can I make that fits with my concept, with the Garden Guerilla concept, and with trying to mix some gardening tools and some concepts from the idea of guerrilla gardening. So I know we have hand-based trowels, stuff we can carry because we're going to go work. We're going to walk with a bucket to our median that needs beautification, and we have to be able to carry this stuff. So a little hand trowel sounds like a great thing. We're going to have seed bombs involved because the little seed bombs, those packets of seeds, are absolutely kind of a symbol. They symbolize guerrilla gardening because you're tossing those seeds in there from a distance, and it ends up as a beautiful garden full of native flowers. But it's something where that is only used for that. If you could reach it and plant it yourself, if it was your garden, you wouldn't be hucking a ball of seeds at it, would you? So I thought that's really cool. And then I went ahead and made the harvest patch because the other thing people were also doing were taking some of those derelict spaces and making food gardens so that people in the local area could have access to some fresh fruits and vegetables, stuff like that. So I thought the concept of harvest was another thing. And in the militaria kind of idea, I was like, oh, what about ranks or divisions? Maybe these are divisions of people who have different jobs. Well, you have somebody who is out there doing the gardening part. You have seed bombers. You have somebody who is out there dropping seeds for a reason. We have someone who is a harvest person. This is their concept. The harvesters are now a themed unit in this imaginary thing I'm thinking of. So I just kind of let that flow, right? I start with that inspiration. I'm like, okay, guerrilla gardening. I want to make these patches. How am I going to do that? Then I thought, okay, let's do what we call R&D, right? Usually that's research and development. My good friend Jay Bissell always makes a joke about it as an artist himself, someone who has done art over his career. Then he calls it rip off and duplicate, which is the not so nice way of saying retail research. And what this is to look at existing pieces that are inspirational, that might kind of get us there, get us some concepts, some ideas to work from, and then think about how that would fit into our overall look, our overall ethos. What is it we're trying to figure out? So I thought, all right, let's do some R&D, right? Let's do some retail research, look at some stuff that's there, but with the concept that I'm going to alter and remix this stuff. So what do I call this? A remix or mashup. So remixing and mashing up, it's one of the ways that we can get inspiration. So we call it inspiration instead of knockoffs. Why? We're not going to take exactly what somebody has done that's before us and just knock it off and reproduce it exactly the way it was. We're going to remix or mash up. Remix, take the existing thing and change things about the individual piece. That's one way we can handle it. We have an individual piece and we're just going to change items within that individual piece. That can be a remix. We're just going to do maybe something that's similar to somebody's done, but differently. And I think what's even better is when we do the mashup, which is like I'm telling you, I kind of came to the concept in this mashup way, right? militaria on one side and the gardening setup on the other side. So I'm taking a concept or a design style, militaria, and then I'm going to take my actual theme or subject, the gardening, and specifically the guerrilla gardening, and now I'm going to take the style from one thing, the actual content from the other, and mash those two things together so that I've got this military style guerrilla gardening themed piece. And in the process of doing that, I'm also remixing. I'm not just taking straight military patch shapes, though I started there and we'll get there, and putting those themes into those straight military patch shapes. I literally changed everything about the patch so that I have a style, but even the shapes of the patches themselves are now referring to the theme. So that is one of the things I always talk about. How do we get inspiration without just knocking something off or just looking for a vector file and trying to convert it? Well, we do some of that research. We research it. We look at it. We kind of take in the concepts. What are some color things we can take from this concept? What are some shapes that are in this concept or some layouts? What kind of fonts or typefaces are being used in this concept? We bring those together with the theme that we have. And what's important about this theme? Guerrilla gardening. Well, gardening, plants, it's green, it's earthy. We got browns and greens, which is a lot like subdued patches in the military kind of setup. So I've got some color hints I can work on. I've got from the military, like I said, I've got divisions and specific jobs. And then from the gardening concept, I have the actual tasks we have to do in order to plant, nurture, and harvest things and bring them in. We actually have all of these different kind of concepts to come together, and then we can sketch out an idea. And it doesn't have to be perfect sketching. My drawings are not fantastic. I am not a traditional standard media artist. I do some digital art. I've done some drawing that's decent, but that's not the primary thing I do. The primary thing I do is digitize. The designing is I would say, a secondary thing, certainly. But we take that together and then we start to do our remix and mashup. And the other thing I always say too is when you get your inspiration, you've been looking at all this stuff for a while, take that inspiration, save it, bookmark all of your folders, bookmark all of your stuff and throw it in a folder so that you know where all of your inspirations come from. Go ahead and Google search, go ahead and look at stock art, get all that stuff together, and then sleep on it. Literally give it a little bit of time. Let it sit on that back burner in your dome and wait for it to boil down into something different, because the component parts will come together in different ways. Also, talk to other people, because the other influences that you might have around you can give you different perspectives on a piece. And by the time you put that all together, mash it up, let it stew for a while, get that remix going, you will end up with something that is more original and in the end doesn't just knock off something that's existing, that's out there. You end up with something that's more original to you, to your concept. So, like I said, militaria, I went through some patch history, and then we started going from sketch to embroidery. We'll get there. But yeah, right, militaria. That's where I kind of started and where the entire concept really kicked off from, right? So let me go ahead and bring something up and I'll show you very similar pieces, something that did kind of get me going. I was thinking, all right, I wanted something that looked like a military patch. And this is kind of what I came across. So one of the things I thought, I wanted to fill this space, and I had already thought about the potential tools that I could have, and I wanted to feature a gardening tool, but make it look very much like something represented in a military fashion. So we have here is the 17th Army Aviation Unit badges, and this is where the set of wings. Now there's all sorts of wing sets, and I've done tremendous numbers of them. Actually, if I bring in any of my kind of photos here, if I go to these photos here, and I'll back up out of this particular photo so we can see what I'm doing here. But if we go into it, obviously I've done tremendous numbers of wing sets. I mean, there's wings on everything, and I've got a lot of military wing sets that are in here, including like the Navy SEAL wings that are on the actual Eagle, anything you work on. Now we have lots of laurel wreaths. These are in a lot of police and military things as well. And honestly, without going through too much more of it, we have tons of that stuff that's possible, but I needed one that was going to fit my format and would look good with the tools that are involved. So we know that I've got my Harvest Heroes stuff as it was. Well, in those Harvest Heroes patches, we're going to need the Garden Guerilla patch. We have this very vertical presentation of this central spade that I wanted. I wanted this little trowel to be in the middle and to be very prominent. So in that case, I wanted something that was going to have some vertical spacing. We can see these wings here have a nice vertical slot right down the middle, and they meet in the center and have a nice area for something to be in that space. And those are largely based, not entirely, but largely based on the wings that are here from the 17th Aviation. So as we can see, very vertical. They fit into this lozenge. And I'll actually say they've done a much better job of making it fit into the space. I think I could have redesigned those in a different way, but we can see I didn't even fully knock the wings off that are here. My wings are two color. They have a different kind of variation in the color scheme. I don't have the little flight feathers that are down here at the bottom. I haven't done any of that to kind of take from it. But I would say it's fair to say that that shape of the wings is the shape that I was looking for and is what I was looking at toward as inspiration. Uh, in in kind of a change from normal shapes of wings that aren't set up so vertically. You don't see a lot of that. You usually see a lot of horizontally spread wings. If you search like military wings, what you're going to get are a lot of Air Force wings that are very much out toward the sides, very horizontally aspected. Whereas seeing this piece and having this in my mind, just kind of almost subconsciously, because I've done and seen so many military patches over the years, military patches, military designs, I had known I'd seen this. I started looking for it, found something similar, but when I went to go look for it again, I couldn't find my original inspirational file, but then saw this and went, this has got to be it. This is the one. So we look at this piece again and then get back to the Garden Guerilla, and you can see, though they are of a different aspect and shape, that's very much where we started from. So where we start from, we've got our vertical wings. I need to fill a vertical space, and we're looking with the kind of tool I wanted to fit this trowel in the center, and that makes sense. We've got our vertical wings. So vertical wings come directly from this sort of inspiration. After that, the other things to look at, well, I wanted to do a rocker set. And funny enough, the rocker set really kind of comes from my own inspiration, right? This is something that I'd already done. And I'm going to try and kind of show you guys more of it. But one of the things that I had done was I had done a rocker set for an event that was a memorial event for Scotty Bobbitt, a person who had died, who was pararescue. And in his rocker set, we actually had first an initial set of just a single rocker, and then we started doing rockers top and bottom. And I'll actually just show you the original design with the single rocker. But when I saw this piece, it's kind of what I was thinking with the rockers. So I thought you could also do additional rocker style designs down the road. But let me go ahead and bring that up. This is the Scotty Bobbitt patch that I originally did many years ago, but we since had done several other rockers. What ended up happening with this rocker patch set, if you've seen me talk about it before, is that this memorial ride that we did the original patch set for, and this is, by the way, another one of those times where could not afford to order these. Plus, though this is the initial rocker, even in the first run, and we corrected some of the curvature in later runs, these rockers eventually were done with each year of the ride, and people who came later on in the process riding this same motorcycle ride, memorial ride down the road, would go back, even if they didn't have the patch before, and get the rockers from previous years they'd already been in if they didn't get them. So what would end up happening is, like we have in this bottom rocker here, people would wear this as a shoulder patch and then add additional tab rockers down the sleeve as they went on. So this was kind of the original rocker set that kind of made me think, oh, I really love this concept of having a central patch with rockers. And on some of them, we had rockers on the top and bottom for this same patch set. But that was kind of the patch set that gave me the concept. I'm like, I really love the idea of this patch set that has a rocker added to it or a tab added to it, and that could be altered, right? We could change what was going on in the text here or add multiple tabs down the piece. And I thought it was kind of a cool concept. Didn't go forward with that, making additional tab designs, but this was the original concept, is a central shoulder rocker that had a design with tabs above and below for text so that I could have the central rocker just be kind of the design element. Now, this one certainly has its own text involved and everything else, the dates being separate, but I just liked the look of it. I liked the concept, and I really honestly just loved the rockers. So when I went to go ahead and do my Guerrilla Gardener piece, and I'll actually show you again, the Garden Guerilla piece, I wanted to have those rockers so I could have a central patch and rocker set. I just love the look of the triple set. And certainly I'll argue that in my head, there probably was a little bit of the concept of motorcycle batch patches as well, where we have rockers top and bottom. I'm sure there's a little bit of that influenced it. It wasn't a conscious thing, but I just do like the concept of this separation of the top and bottom rockers. So that was the other kind of part that went to. I was like, all right, I have the rockers, I have that. And then, of course, I'm looking at shape because, I thought, what could be an iconic shape that still has something that tucks into those rockers? Because I could do that lozenge shape you just saw, the straight horizontal or verticals on both sides with the top and bottom arc. Lovely shape, good way to handle it. That central pill kind of shape is a great shoulder shape. No reason not to do it. But I wanted something more. I wanted to integrate those design concepts. And so, of course, I just realized I'm like, oh, gardening, man, why not do a little terracotta pot? And I know that's not guerrilla gardening necessarily, but just the concept of the terracotta pot, it fits so well into the color scheme. The subdued colors are just straight up, Lowe's terracotta pot. And if we look at the images on this, you can see exactly what I'm saying. Just looking this up at the home store, when you're looking at one kind of a little off angle, just a little bit above it, what do you get? You get this lovely curvature at the top. We get this curvature at the bottom, and you have this nice little well, this shadow in here. And this is not the image I took from, but as you can see, whenever one of these is pictured, we have a lovely shape where if we look at the outline, the negative space around it, and ignore the way the actual piece is made, curve that's sticking up out of the top, curve at the bottom. And I have a nice big open field we can work on, but with a little bit of texture that I could add for the pieces themselves. So when we go back to look at the Garden Guerilla piece, what do we have here? And I'll admit the colors are a little too dark in the center. I think the actual piece that I ran, of course, I can show you again, is not quite as dark as that, is not quite as deep into that well. We do have that kind of well in the background. We have the interior of the pot. We have the lines and the shading showing the curvature of the pot with a nice open fill on this outside edge. We've got some shading that's inside the pot itself. And the main body in the shape, we get curvature at the bottom, curvature at the top that fits nicely with a slightly offset size pair of rockers. So that's kind of where I came up with it. And this was the initial thing. Originally wasn't going to necessarily be a trio. The first patch is this one. And like I said earlier, the first thing I did was come up with this central element. I'm like, all right, I love this concept of the winged trowel, right? This is the sword of the guerrilla gardener is the winged trowel. And so the very first thing I did was get lazy. And this is the first thing I made. I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to do a shoulder patch. Here we go. Regular shape, shield shape, no big. I've got this set up here. I've got some standard kind of block text that I'm just going to arch top and bottom, no big deal. And then I looked at this and I was like, man, this could be so much more. And when I first laid this out, that was the very initial piece I started on. And then I went, no, man, I got to do something more with it. And that's where I started going further. And I looked to that remix, that mashup, because this was the very first thing I did to show someone else the concept and say, this is what I'm thinking about making these patches. But, making this patch style design, actually, like I said, it wasn't a patch originally. And then this was the final result. And in this case, this one was done with fills. It's the one that's on my website at theonlystitch.com. It does not have the patch setup in it. We're going to show you a patch setup version later, but this piece was just done as flat fills inside. The other thing to notice about it, we do have this really idiosyncratic text. This is kind of a modern tech text that does have kind of the look of maybe a military block or a stencil, but we have this nice lowercase style N on Garden Guerilla. So it's really a more modern tech take on that font. And I can see going both ways. As you know, the original one here was just a really standard kind of tall, like condensed block. But this piece is where I kind of wanted to set it apart and say I wanted something blocky, but with a more modern font for the time. And at the time, we had a lot of these tech fonts that looked a little bit more, truly enough, they look like retro high tech. This is like the NASA font. This is almost like a retro tech font rather than a modern thing. But it was this kind of, cyber tech font flourishing that was going on at the time. And I took that version of what would really be a classic kind of octagonal block font and went with it. So it's still kind of military stylings, but wanted to try something different. And in this case, I didn't use an embroidery font. I used a vector font, did my initial work in vector, and then came in and did my font work after the fact. So this was digitized from something that I warped in the art stage. I did my art and layout ahead of time, though I didn't do all of the art and layout. And I'll show you a piece of that later. If we go and check out the Seed Bomber piece, the Seed Bomber piece has all of this shading that's in it and kind of detail carving in the leaves. And you can see we have this leaf-shaped central patch element as well. This stuff, I didn't draw every single thing. I didn't even draw it bumpy. I just did layout work. I find that I do a lot of my creative work in the embroidery software itself, whereas things like text layouts, if it's something that is not in an embroidered font, there's a high chance that I'll stop and do this in the vector side of things. I'll grab my layout for the rest of this stuff, go to my vector art and create things like these text layouts. And you can also see we have that kind of textile M in Bomber here, because I eventually did decide that I wanted to be kind of a system where we have the same font for everything. And we have very similar rockers, but we also get these individual idiosyncratic patch shapes for these central patches. So there's our Seed Bomber. And then, of course, we have our Harvest Heroes as well that we're going to get into. But the Harvest Heroes piece, it actually has some more going on with it. So we'll see if we can get that one up in a minute here as well. But yeah, Harvest Heroes piece is a little bit different and not quite the same as the rest of them. So hopefully we can take a look at that. But yeah, we can see that we have the Harvest Heroes piece, and I've got a couple versions of the Harvest Heroes piece when we check that out. And we'll get to kind of take a look at that one as well as we get going. But let's go ahead and move this off screen for just a second so we can get that sorted out. But yeah, the Harvest Heroes piece also has some other things that are happening with it that are really cool, but it's not necessarily, quite the same because the Harvest Heroes piece did eventually get a full patch conversion. That's really what I'm going to talk about here is how that kind of ended up. So hopefully we can kind of take a look at that and we'll discuss the different versions of that. Because like I said, there's different tools that are available to me now that weren't available then. So not only do we have the Harvest Heroes patches here, I'm actually going to show you a version that was done with Stitch Artist 3, which is the same kind of tools that are available in the same stitch types, at least, that are available in Brilliance Merrily, where we get this cool faux mirrored edge. You'll notice that the original versions of the patch, even the patches, not just the patch style designs, but the patches themselves were satin, or what we sometimes will see called a perfect edge. It was a satin pre-cut style, so that it just had a satin edge on it. But I have to say, in my newer reworks of the design, where I've got this faux mirrored edge from our edge stitch type, really does give it quite a lot of texture. And I think, honestly, I look at these now and I want to go back and remake them with the with the faux mirrored edge, because that faux mirrored edge that we have really does lend it even more of this authenticity, where it looks more like the original Militaria, the pieces I was looking at. As we discussed earlier, if we kind of take a look at those pieces again, so much of the stuff that we have from Militaria, especially classic military pieces, are going to be done finished with a traditional mirrored edge, like we're seeing here. And the traditional mirrored edge on these pieces really, and you see they're often sold as collector pieces, really is something different to kind of look at and get a concept of. But I really do like that traditional mirrored edge sometimes just is the way to kind of note this classic influence. You can definitely get perfect edge, satin edge patches. People are doing hot cut patches like that all over the place. It is always an option to get that. But as you can see from some of these, this is a Vietnam era version of that patch. That lovely texture that's there in the mirrored edge is something that can really lend to some of that creative looks and some of the textures. So I kind of really do love that too. So kind of a very cool thing. We do have a question about the Merrily thing versus the Stitch Artist 3. Stitch Artist 3 lets you draw any shape at all in the world and apply that edge treatment to it, if you were talking about that as a product thing. Whereas Merrily does page wrap, I'll show you that later, or has built-in shapes. It has a library of shapes you can use, and it allows you to do some tweaking on those and rescaling those, resizing those pre-made patch edges, or to create, it will create its own circles, rectangles, rounded rects, or it will allow you to do a wrap, which is a contour around anything you throw in the middle of the shape or in the middle of the page. And you can contour that with your own patch. And I'll show you that in a minute. The ones that I did originally were done manually, where I drew the shapes myself. So I would have done those if I were in Stitch Artist. Originally, they were done in Wilcom. I've now redone certain ones of those in Stitch Artist. In Stitch Artist, you would use the edge stitch type to do that. And it's a little bit different process, but that way you can draw any shape edge you want. And that's the thing. Back in the day, I did some fake or faux marrow style stitching by using motif stitching. So motifs along a path. And it worked pretty well. It was a concept that I used for years, but you'll see I went to a lot of satins because it doesn't handle corners very well. And it takes a lot of fiddling around to get it just right. You have to have a real technical desire to work on those things. Some people make great ones. Jeff Fuller makes some great ones where he's used motifs and then worked on corners and curves himself. He's doing that work. Whereas the stuff from Merrily and from Stitch Artist 3 is automated, and it automates all those corners for you. So if you're someone who doesn't want to move around motifs and mess with them, it's going to handle edge densities and moving around corners and handling mitering, things like that on its own. So it's just a tool that we didn't have back then. And I think if I were doing this again with the specialty shapes that I had, I would definitely look at using something like Merrily to do those special shapes and do that mitering. So it handles corners, handles mitering by itself. So it really depends on what you're working on. However, what I'm going to say is You can do patches with anything that you need to with the software. You can use essentially an applique method and make any kind of patches. We've got different kinds of patch style or patch production styles. I'm just going to bring these up briefly. I'm not going to describe every single thing about them, but we can do, if we're doing machine embroidered edge patches. So embroidered edge patches, not using an after the fact marrowing option. So if you know what a marrowing machine is, it's very much like a serger. It's an overlock machine that wraps the edge of the patch, and you hand guide your patch through this machine to wrap that edge top and bottom. It is a overlock style machine, whereas we have interlock machines where we have a bobbin on the bottom and we have a stitch on the top. Well, embroidered edge patches, we have to do something to treat the edge or to make the edge clean or cut it away. And there's multiple methods we can use. We can use soluble stabilizers, water soluble heat away stabilizers, where we pre-cut or hand cut our material. We cut away our material before we run our edges, or we pre-cut our material and place it and then run our edges on top. And then when we're done, we can take them out of this material, wash it away, heat it away, or we can use the plastic method. Sometimes there are also plastic style heat away stabilizers where we sew everything down. We either have to cut away or pre-cut our material if we're using material, or we can use an all thread style of patch, which I can talk about in a moment. And we stitch it entirely, including the edges, and then we just tear away the outside edges. And most of these, we're going to use heat to clean up any fuzzies that are around the edge. And that's a plastic film, or it can be a heat away plastic film. We have these thermoplastic heat away films, these polyolefin films that are now sold. They have a little bit of texture to them, which is also helpful. And they're thicker, so they don't tear away like some early water soluble film type. The plastic looking water solubles I don't love for patches. I like the ones that look like fabric. They look fibrous. That's what I used to use for mine because a little bit of water was fine by me. I wanted a nice malleable patch that when I sewed it to a garment wasn't very stiff. It was something I was doing for wardrobe. I did them for TVs and movies where they wanted something that looked like it was worn pretty frequently. So having a super stiff brand new patch wasn't really a benefit. Though when I did need a super stiff patch, you can use support materials like crinoline and or using thermoplastic adhesive sheets where you press that on and then cut away your excess thermoplastic adhesive, and then you make an iron-on or heat press patch out of that piece. That's great. They are very stiff. If you intend to sew them on and you want them to be very malleable, then you don't have to put that in there. And like I said, you can not only make patches with fabric, you can make them with thread only. And in fact, what I'm going to call up on this is if you want to know more about these patches and all of those kind of details, we have a couple of shows that we've already done on this. Episodes 11 and 12 of the Takeup are very specific to these patch styles. They are there for you at any time you want to. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the comments a couple of links here. This is episode 11 in the comments. Go ahead and grab that. Episode 11. You can also look these up at your leisure. The second link is for episode 12. Those are the two initial earlier pieces I did entirely on patch execution. So if you're here right now and you're like, man, this guy's been talking for 40 minutes about design stuff, and I would just want to know how to make a patch, bail out if you have to. Jump out, go to the other piece, because I'm going to talk about the different methods of patch making, hot cutting with a hot knife, which is more like a wood burning tool, where we cut out a polyester, we can melt the edges down. All of those methods of how you get a clean edge, head on over to those other articles, those other pieces. They'll also link back to articles I've written previously about patch making. I think I'm probably going to do some more videos and articles on patch making soon. I know also Lisa, who is here in the comments, has done some great stuff and has some stuff coming up about using these kinds of materials to make edged objects, whether it's patches or other objects that are similar. Like I said, patches and emblems, you can find that stuff in my channel at any time. We'll get a little bit more into how these were made. At the same time, today is really about investigating the design, and I'm going to show you some pieces of the design just to kind of walk you through how it's put together and discuss, like I said, patch making, design, and inspiration as well. But like I said, multiple ways this can be done. You can use material. I usually use polyester twill. That is the classic patch material, but people use all manner of materials to make patches. Polyester is great because you can hot cut it if you want to, which means you can melt the edges with a wood burning tool or cut it out by placing your piece on a slab of glass and cutting across it glass or stone countertops some people make for their patch stations. where you can cut through all of the stabilizers and everything and leave yourself a fairly clean edge using that hot tool. But honestly, you got to be a little careful using that one. Water soluble, you sew it all together, sew your edges on, and then rinse the rest of the stabilizer away. And I can show you more about that. And of course, the plastic method where you just tear it out. You sew it through a heavy plastic material that is meant for this. Or honestly, you go to your local Walmart, get that 20 gauge tablecloth plastic, which is another way people have been doing it. And you'll see it online all over the place. Sew out your patches and run with it. Pre-cut, you cut your material before into the shapes and then stick it down, lay it out with some light embroidery specific adhesive into the area that it's supposed to go. Post cut, you lay down a big slab of material, stitch down some edges, cut close to the edges, just like you would with a traditional hand cut applique. And we then run our edges after the fact over that. Or we can do a fully thread-based emblem wherein we create essentially a fabric out of multiple layers of underlayment and top stitching that becomes the background of the patch. It's tons of stitches, but it lets you use any color thread you have and to do zero pre-cutting or post-cutting of material. So it can be very easy for people who have more machine time than they have either material to do the patch on hand or time and effort that they can give to cutting and cleaning up edges. All of those methods are available to you, but really any of those methods, we're going to make a pretty good looking patch. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and bring up some other pieces real quick. We're going to look at our gallery real quick and just talk a little bit about patches. So we know about our patch style designs, where we started, right? First thing we had were patch style designs. So we have the Harvest Heroes was the third one in the series. What do we have here? We got our top and bottom rocker. We have this bushel. So yet another thing, very much like our plant pot. We have a bushel. So we've got a basket. It's got these little strakes behind it. You can see the basket's shape with our little sickle and our wheat representing harvesting, right? Representing the concept of harvesting these pieces, right? Harvesting this wheat and being that division. But we have our idiosyncratic patch. We've got our nice colors. And once again, you can see us using our same kind of techie army style font there. But as you guys know, I've made all manner of multiple pre-shaped patches. These are actually both material and full fill. So this one is for a motorcycle club for policemen called the Regulators. And this piece has pre-cut or post-cut banners that we did, or pre-cut banners that we did. Materials pre-cut, but we did stitch on top of the entirety of it for the Regulators and the Albuquerque, New Mexico patch. But you can see that we also had full show through in the center with this skull patch, and in the hat, all of the black that's in here is actually the background material, whereas all of the rest of this is one color of ivory thread with the little red dot eyes, and then we have our cowboy hat element and our satin stitch star that's up there. But I've done tons of other free floating patches, and most of these were done with the water soluble method, where I used a big span of that fibrous water soluble and then had used a plotter cutter. So in this case, back in the day, it was an old Roland plotter, sign vinyl plotter that had a 60-degree blade in it to pre-cut pieces. This is my Navy SEAL back patch that I did. Same kind of thing. All of the yellow in here is the polyester twill material, whereas it was pre-cut and laid down, and then we even have inside cuts. So this is something you can't be doing with a mirroring machine. These were all done with a perfect edge or a satin edge that some people will call it. But as you can see, we ended up going eventually to making these into a full patch set. This is a satin edged patch set based on Harvest Heroes, and this actually shows through this background material is the actual patch material. That is a polyester twill that's in the center there. And as we can see, we have these satin style edges, but the way it was originally run, without going too far into the weeds for how these pieces were done, the way it was originally run was on water soluble materials. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. This is a double layer of fibrous water soluble material. You could have probably done it with a single layer. This one's a little thin, but this was done again by stitching placement lines, as you can see here, putting down the pre-cut material, tacking down the edges, running the central material, and then running the final edge out before we went to rinsing out the patches. So that's the thing. At the end, those got rinsed out. And a lot of the ones that we have in this set, a bunch of the original patches I did were done in that same fashion. As you can see, we can see it for this piece here, that this is a test of the Merrily software edge. So this is the edge that's in Merrily and Stitch Artist 3. And this is a patch that I designed just for fun, the New Hamlin Police Department. And you can see, if you know anything about fairy tales, this is the Pied Piper of Hamlin that I digitized in the center and made up my little fake city. And this is me rinsing it away. And you can see that as it rinses away, all of that material that you're seeing in this previous piece, all of that material that looks like solid stabilizer, it washes entirely away, leaving you with a completely clean edge. So that's the water soluble method. And that's kind of how I often did patches. So a lot of these patches that you're seeing here, these were done with the plastic method. So stitched on plastic and then ripped out. And that's for the show, The Night Shift. We did those for San Antonio Police. One with commercial plastic, one with plastic directly out of, like I said, out of the Walmart fabric section, 20 gauge plastic out of that. And the other one, as you can see here, done on a commercial system. This is the Madeira multifunctional system, and it has a window of plastic that's being held into a hoop. And that's one of the other ways we can do that. But as we can see, there's just a lot of different ways we can come up with that, up to and including stitching on existing patches. And I kind of put that here just as a mention. I've done tons of patches by just getting pre-edged blanks and running text on them, or pre-edged blanks and sublimating them. There's a million ways to get an emblem that looks good. Most of the ones that you're seeing here may be done, like I said, a lot of them are done with water soluble. This is a water soluble edge. Whereas these are commercially produced patches that I worked on the original design work for, but these are done hot cut. You can see there's a little tiny bit of the fabric on the outside. These were hot cut after the fact. After this was sewn out, they cut the entire stack of glue and fabric with a hot knife. So these were hot cut patches that were done after the fact. But all of these produce nice edges. Like, there's no reason. And this, honestly, this is a hot cut patch. And you can see the people who did this one, much, much closer edge. They almost got coverage on this. There's just little spots of the material sticking out. And that's the classic Bosque del Apache patch that I've shown you guys multiple times when we're talking about some of the digitizing techniques that went into it. But all of those patches are viable, right? And custom shaped contour patches with satins it's a classic choice. If you really need to make a patch, satin edge is not a bad thing. But I have to argue, ever since I saw what we could do with the Merrily edge, the programmatic Merrily edge that handles this cornering so nicely, I really have wanted to go back and remake my stuff, because if we look at these pieces compared to some of those, I just really love that texture, especially when the edge can be this clean if we use a nice method that allows for it. So like I said, we got the original Garden Guerilla design. Here it is. It was in that original format, and it really gave birth to the other designs that were in the series. We ended up, before we get through all this stuff, like I said, I've done tons of wings. This is another one of the ones, the Nob Hill Bar and Grill Paratrooper, ignore the central material if you're easily offended, had these nice big spreading wings. And I've done quite a few of these also for traffic. You wouldn't believe, but a lot of the highway patrols have wings on a motorcycle wheel for highway patrols. So I've done quite a lot of wings for those folks too. But like I said, we started with these patch style designs. We have the Seed Bomber design, which is another one I'll show you. I've done some work on that one that was just some sketch work. The Harvest Heroes design, which this one eventually was the one I made into the first patch set. So the Harvest Heroes patch set, of course, is here. So like I said, it really was kind of an evolution. And that's the thing I also want to make it kind of clear, is that this is always about evolution. You can kind of move and think of these different subjects, these different abilities, and build one to the other until we get different kinds of edges, different kinds of treatments, different kinds of design work, and we can end up with something interesting. This is another one I did for a good friend of mine, Mr. X Stitch himself. He did this piece of graffiti. He was just marker graffiti. He was playing around with it, and I made him this piece, and it has a really big, thick edge on it. And this is actually done by layering multiple satin stitches together. And very much like the modern Merrily stitch that we have, the Merrily stitch has a supportive zigzag that's inside of it to make it a little bolder, a little thicker. Very similar thing here, where back in the day, I just programmed a central satin stitch that was a little thinner than the satin stitch on the outside and built up a large double satin edge to make this big, thick edge on this patch. Once again, this one's done in the water soluble method, has a nice clean edge. We see it sitting here on some glitter vinyl. Glitter vinyl is not part of the deal. It was just a cool background. But this nice clean black edge you're seeing here, done with the water soluble patch method. But let's go ahead and get into the designs really quickly. I don't want to go too far with the rest of this, just to let you know, hey, these are the different ways we worked on things. Seed Bomber piece was another one that was interesting. The big interesting thing about that is I literally sketched this thing out on almost nothing. I almost had no materials for it. And then went from that to the full Seed Bomber piece, mostly in software. And the thing to say about that is, though you can do a lot of pre-work, you don't always have to work in the art as much. Working in the art side of this is not always necessary. If you're really comfortable in the embroidery side of it, I mean, there's really nothing stopping you from doing a lot of your work in the embroidery side. And in fact, I find because I'm working with thread, the embroidery tools make the most sense to me. I don't always like to see the other kind of tool sets. It's not really what I'm looking for. I don't always need all that detail. To that point, I'm going to show you really quickly the amount of work that I did before I went to full embroidery. And when we're talking about that seed bomber patch, right? So let's go back and look at the seed bomber patch really quickly. If I can pull that up and you can just take a look at the actual patch itself, I think you'll see that there's some detail that's there. And then we'll talk about the design itself. But let's bring this up. So this is the seed bomber patch, and I'll go ahead and get you a nicer version of this. I accidentally grabbed my low res version, but you can see that we've got some nice embroidered detail in the middle of this piece. In fact, I think even if we look at our, we can kind of see it in the seed bomber section here. You can see all the detail. We see that it's got some shading that's involved. And I'll go ahead and grab our actual file if we can. We'll go ahead and take that. We see our harvest patches here, certainly, but let's go ahead and take a look at our seed bomber patch. So here we are with our seed bomber patch style design. We've got some shading. We've got kind of these lumpy textures here. We actually can also see that we've got these satin stitch seeds that are in this piece. So there's some shine. We've got a nice curved randomized stitch length on the fill that's in here. We see that nice curved fill. And we actually have a secondary curved fill for the top that's going on for the little stem of this bomb. We also have two satin stitches coming together at different angles for the seeds. So we get a different shine on one of these leaves than the other leaf on the little sprout that's there. So we have this connected kind of thing. We've got shading that's done kind of manually in a fill type style. We've got some shading that's done manually following and contrary to the curves in this middle color. The other thing you're going to notice is all of the little seed satins are connected by the shading, so we don't have to trim. All of this tan color here that you're seeing is one connected filament of thread that starts here, goes in through, does each one of these seeds, and it uses the shading to connect to these different areas to make the highlights possible and to connect into the rest of this shading. So that's all done right here. But that's the thing. The first thing I did was draw literally what we would call a napkin sketch on a Post-it note that was just the essential kind of shape of the seed bomb that had kind of these concepts and had the areas with the little seeds. It had this kind of chunky texture on the outside. It had the old school cartoon bomb that has the stem and the fuse, that the lit fuse is being replaced by the seed with the leaves sticking out. Now I could see maybe doing a third leaf so it looked more like a little sparking lit fuse, but I love the idea of the sprout and the very bomb-like shape, the cartoon classic big black bomb shape that we've seen a million times over, and that's all I sketched. I wanted, however, to get my layout kind of set up, and I wanted my leaf shape to look a certain way, and so I went ahead and did some vector work first. And this is what the vector work was. And that's all it was. I didn't go through and do all the shading. Literally, I looked at this piece, I looked at my original design where I did some sketching and said, all right, what do I need? Well, I want to get the placement right. I want to get the shape of the leaf just so I know exactly where it's going to be. I have some concepts about the way the leaf should be. And if you look at this, the stem here looks kind of weird and screwy. It's not the right shape. It's not exactly how it's going to be. I had a concept for more shadow down here at the bottom than I really did, but I wanted to just give the idea that there was a shadow underneath it. I knew there'd have to be some highlights somewhere in it, and I wanted it to look like some soil, so it had some texture. But what I actually drew was a straight circle right out of the drawing tool. I went in and scribbled around the areas of shading I had done in my pencil sketch, and then I went ahead and dropped in my little leaves so I can kind of see how the sprout was going to go. And I think the angle is not exactly what I ended up with. And in the end, I ended up with something that was a lot more attractive than that. But I went straight from what you're looking at here to the embroidery system. So when I went in, I redrew on top of it. I drew my shapes and immediately realized, I don't want a super, super round bomb. I want to have it look like a hand-packed chunk of soil. I want to have a little lightness in that shading. So I backed off some of that shading so it wasn't just a solid area. And I went ahead and added these highlights following some of those little chunky lumps that I had in the piece. But you can see the chief area of highlighting on the top edge is on the opposite side. If we think of the light as coming, and I'll have to go backwards for this, coming down from, the other corner here, and then drawing down from this top corner to the bottom, from here up at the top, down toward this bottom where my shadow is, and there's going to be a highlight on the opposite side. Admittedly, I went ahead and used that light color also just to notate the concept of different kinds of soil packed together, but we still have a highlight and a shadow that we worked on. But as we can see with the way this is put together, and I can also run it back for you if you want to see on this design, we can kind of see how it's layered together, how the pieces are done, where we have this kind of manual shading on top of this piece. Now, first, in this particular piece, we do have a curved fill that I used inside of the leaf. I love a curved fill just for showing a little bit of volume and changing the light on a path. I left room for the bomb. Why did I leave room for the bomb? You could certainly slice that into multiple fills if you wanted to. I thought having the full density filled bomb with details on top of that background wasn't good for this design. This is also not a true patch, this design. This patch is a patch-like design, a patch-inspired design. So this has a flat fill with the hole left in the middle. We now have the stem and the veins that are made of just double straight stitch, real simple. And then we have the outside edge. Why is the outside edge done before the rest of the stuff in the middle? Because this particular design is not a true patch. This has not been converted over to a patch, so I'm not worried about the edges tearing out. This was meant to be stitched on full fabric, and that's the version that's over at theonlystitch.com. But then we can see that we've got an edge run underlay and a tatami underlay or a fill underlay, parallel or perpendicular underlay that is under the initial fill. We can see the curved fill building up, and you'll see how that randomized texture is there. That chunky texture is just from setting the randomized slider up. So play with that randomized slider. If you're in Stitch Artist, there's a little RND on your fill stitches. Slide that up, turn up that percentage, and you can get some really interesting organic textures. After that, we can see that we actually start from the other corner, and here's my shading done with manual stitches. And you can see that I've layered a couple different layers in. There's one layer, and then I track back up to make a highlight. Then each of the seeds. There's the shading, and we see there's a nice, it's much tighter up at the top where the primary highlight is. We connect to each of the seeds and down. Then we see our final dark shading that also has some little cracks that I drew in manually with kind of a wickle stitch. I'm also outlining some of the seeds and details. So the seeds, details, and cracks get outlined, and then the outer edge of the entire bomb gets outlined. Last but not least, we have our little sprouts with two different angles on our satin stitches and a little green outline of their own. And then we go up into these rockers. I think the rockers are not as interesting because honestly what they are, nice fill, nice satin, and text. If this was done for a patch, I would have put that satin edge last. And in fact, if we go check out the other patches, we're going to go back to that. We're going to go to our patches that we have for the Harvest Heroes. We'll take a look at those. Very different. But like I said, it starts from this. It starts from this. It was a literal sketch. It was a concept. And then I did a little bit of vector work just to keep it clear. And once we did the vector work, I didn't go through and do all the shading and all the colors. I went ahead and let that be something I did in embroidery. Not everybody be comfortable with this. I did have my pencil sketch that had a little more detail in it that I could look at, but I didn't really scan that and work on it. I went ahead and drew this because I wanted a nice, clean, very geometric kind of edge for that piece. So like I said, it really, your input process, your sketch to embroidery process can take a lot of different tacks. You can draw something out entirely in traditional media, in pencil, in pens and markers, scan it, take pictures of it, flatten it out, size it, and then embroider on, digitize on top of that. You can draw your own vector, get the vector exactly how you want it with color and clarity, exactly the way you want the patch to look, and then bring it in and work from that. Or you can do something like I do, which is to give yourself the guidelines and hints you need, and then work in the embroidery software where I can see threads thickness to a better degree. I can see stitch lengths. I can see texture. Because as you guys know, I don't think of embroidery as printing with thread. I think of it as sculpting. And in order to get sculpting, I need highlights and shadows and texture. And that's going to be down at the stitch level. That's going to be at the stitch settings, the variables level, not just what's there in the art. The art's great. Working with really complete art can be helpful. In the end, what I really need are the hints, the shapes, the layout, and especially anything like perfect shapes. The text, I did lay out those bars because I had custom text that wasn't made for embroidery and it had to be warped. So it's something that I couldn't warp the vector in the embroidery software. I did the vector warping and the arching of the letters outside because I wanted to use my own fonts that were not made for embroidery. These days, with the preponderance of like BX fonts for Brilliance, I think you could probably find something in the BX range. I can't imagine you couldn't find something that wouldn't help for most designs where you probably could do that text yourself and also be able to retype it and use whatever you wanted down the road. But If you wanted something super custom, you can do that in the art side and then do the digitizing after the fact, which is really common. Most commercial digitizers aren't doing a lot of art. I was rare that I did as much design as I did, because a lot of commercial digitizers, they would be brought something, or their customers would be bringing something that was pretty well finished that had to be a certain way, and the only design work was to show them stuff that wouldn't work and maybe do some layout changes. Whereas someone like me, I ended up doing a lot more creative work because I was partnering with people to make the embroidery design process better for them. So if they had things that were difficult, hard to figure out, hard to get a handle on, they would often have me kind of help them work that out so that they knew exactly what they were working with. So they could kind of have a concept pre-made, ready, that they knew was right for embroidery before they ended up in the digitizing stage. So I think a lot of the work that I did, and especially my personal work, is going to be more likely to have designs behind it, because unlike some folks on Etsy these days, I tend to try not to outright use copyrighted art and make my own designs from it. When I do my own self-guided projects, I try to use historical art or something interesting that I found, or to design it myself everywhere I can. Hey, nothing wrong with that. You're making your own pieces exactly for yourself. The damages are low. Sometimes you're still afoul of copyright law, but at the same time, you're making a piece for yourself. I understand that's not a huge deal. But when I'm trying to teach you guys or show you something cool, I try and make something that I know I am fully in the clear on, and that it's something that I've made for myself so that anyone can use it and no one has any concerns. But let's get back to the Harvest Heroes piece. I think we're going to talk about the patch process just a little bit more and discuss how they're put together, and then we'll kind of finish this up. So let's start here. So this is our Harvest Heroes piece done two ways, right? So the original way that this was done was all with satin stitch set up. So if we take a look at this piece, the original one really was all satins. So it still is done in an applique style. So this was made for, and when you see this simulated background fabric that's here, this was made with a placement line with a zigzag tack, and then we're going to do our coverage last. So in a sorted piece like this, what we can kind of see as we build it up is that you're going to get a placement and a tack down to hold things down. Then we're going to run things like the central design material. So we're going to run our outlines, our shading, anything that's in the center of that piece. In this case, we have the shading that shows the open top of our bushel, that kind of background shading, including the darker shading that goes around those edges and the outlining. Then we can see our little wheat sheaf. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this just a little bit so you can see how the wheat is put together, because that might be interesting. Like I said, if you guys who are here to do the design analysis, you'll see that I've used, I do have an underlay under this piece so I can lighten up my top density, but this is a nice curved fill, top or bottom to top here. Then when I travel back and do all of my shading and outlines, but then we can see the wheat has these little tiny sharp ends on it. Well, I decided to use a straight stitch to outline all those little sharp ends first. Then we have these individual satin stitches. You'll see these are each little satin stitch nuggets that are kind of woven together in different angles, so I get that nice texture. And then we have our central kind of spike of the wheat. We have the central stem, and we go out and overlap that again and make ourselves 4 little wheat stems here, 5 little wheat stems that overlap and eventually come to the central stem that's on top of all of them, and it gives us that nice raised texture in the center. And then we finish out that bundle by making the rest of the bundle here. As you can see, I've left space for the sickle to go across. Does that matter so much? I think you could totally leave satin on satin there and it wouldn't be a problem, but I was being a stickler for density here today. So I went ahead and cut out that little section in those stems. And you can also see the bindings are satin stitches that go the opposite direction from the rest of the wheat. After that, we have our nice little sickle that's just made up of a couple satin stitches. We have a satin in the top here. And then you'll see for the little ferrule that holds the sickle on, I went ahead and changed the satin stitch direction. We opposed it by 90 degrees. So that this little piece looks like it sticks up by itself. Then we have our handle, and then we have our outline and little outlines and shading that go around that piece. And then, and only then, especially because I often have to work on materials or stabilizers that I'm a little concerned might tear out, especially if you're doing the plastic method, that's when I like to put my edge at the end. Now, the thing I'm going to tell you is a lot of folks will get our tool merrily, or they'll work on, it's not really merrily, but they'll do it in Stitch Artist 3 where they'll make a patch piece and it has it all together. If you're working on a doubled layer of that fibrous water soluble, you often don't have to put your edge at the end. But if you're working on some of the plastics, you'll find that some of them get a little loose, especially if you really are doing a ton of work in the center. But there really is a way to fix that. So let's say you're doing this with merrily style stitching, which is the stitching that's the patch edge component from Stitch Artist 3. What I want to show you is you can still do that. And this one I converted from a stitch file, so it's not as clean in the object tree as you might want it to be, because these are actually stitch elements. Those are not native elements. They were taken from my DST file. So really, the other thing to realize is we can make a patch edge on anything, even an existing embroidery file that doesn't already have one. We can take away the satin edges that were there, because this is from a stitch file. We can see from these elements, these are stitch elements over here, not individual digitized elements. I deleted the stitch files and the placement lines. And what we ended up with here is that I have two edge objects. So two merely edge objects. One in which I only have the turned on, I only have certain parts of it turned on. Let me go into the digitizing section of this. I only have my position turned on and fabric preview so I can see it. So what this edge object is going to do is only sew my positional stitches. And I've got it set for pre-cut. So it's only going to do my positional stitches and my stitches for my tack down that are holding down my material. And then I turned off top stitching. So this is unclicked, turned off top stitching. And then at the end of my patch, after all my other little guys run, I have the outer edge. What is it? It's the same shape, cut and paste right on top. And I've turned back on my top stitching. In this case, I forgot to turn this off. I want to turn off my position stitching. So it's just going to do my top stitching, just my mirrored edge. And all I had to do is cut and paste that same piece, or copy and paste the same shape. So I have one shape that's underneath here, one shape that's on top. They're both the edge shape and they're identical. I just turned off and on the different elements. So if you want to have it in two runs where you do your placement first, do all your center stuff, and do the edge last like I often do, well, then all you have to have is two objects and you turn off and on the pieces that you want. So that's, like I said, that's all done by Stitch Artist 3. Merrilies are very similar, and you can do similar things with that. You can copy paste and turn those things on and off. But in this case, that's how you do it. If you were using Stitch Artist 3 to do it with this automation, lots of people get confounded. So what they end up doing is they make their edge tool, their edge piece, right? They make their piece with drawing with points or with some other vector, and they have everything turned on, and then they think that they have to run their edge before other stuff. The other thing that lets you do is do things like this. My shading goes underneath the edge of the patch. How do you achieve having some element of your patch go underneath the edge? Well, you do your placement stuff in one edge object, turn off your top stitching, do all of your other stitching that goes up under this edge or up to it, then run just the top stitching on your last run, and don't have all that placement stuff inside there, and you can go ahead and run your edge separately from your placement stitches. No problem. It's just a matter of realizing it doesn't have to be one shape. Just like putting a border on a fill, number one, you often have to change those shapes for compensation, but if you want to put a border on a fill, you can use the same shape and just copy and paste. If it's got a big, thick border that's going to cover all your sins, cover all your edges and all of your compensation, you just need two of that same shape and to change what type of shape that's using if we have a central satin border that runs on an edge line. Same thing with applique. You can put your position and your final cover stitching in two different places by just having two pieces and turning on and off the segments you want. Now, that's a Stitch Artist specific thing. You'll find that in other softwares, it's going to be different. The way that they do applique tools may be different. I think it is similar. The turning on and off of things is similar, or they'll let you break up the group. Depends on the tool. But that's the one that I hear often with Stitch Artist 3 or with the Merrily shapes when they convert to objects that you want to do that stuff. Certainly, as an object, you can turn things on and off and use multiple copies to put that placement line, that tack down line, the cut line, if you're doing hand cut in hoop, down underneath your central material. Not a problem, totally an option. And like I said, if you were doing a text piece like we have up here and we're on really nice stable materials, the likelihood is you could totally run the entire piece, including this edge, and have the edge done and run your text after, as long as you're on a very stable stabilizer that is made for patches but is holding together. If you're using a couple layers of that fibrous water soluble, I, even in doing the first satin edge tests, messed up my orders and I ran my borders before my text, and it turned out fine and didn't tear out. So yeah, it really depends on your software exactly how that works. But just remember, just because your object has the opportunity to have all sorts of different things applied to it, doesn't mean you necessarily have to apply all of them. And if you want to use the same outline you drew, the literal vector style shape that is in there for multiple things, you can copy and paste it out and leave one in one type of stitch and use one for another type of stitch. And usually that's used for making bordered objects like this. So different options to do. But like I said, in the original piece, I did this simply with zigzag tools. This was not using an automated applique tool or anything. This was a zigzag stitch It was a placement stitch using straight stitches. It was a zigzag stitch to hold down the initial materials. And then it was a traditional satin at full density to do the edges. So that's also possible. I have to admit, though, looking at this stitch, looking at the kind of how good the Merrily stitch, the edge stitch, the traditional foam marrow stitch we have is these days, really hard to argue that that's not a cool option. So, like I said, these days I've been wanting to redo a bunch of my old patches with this stitch because I think I like the concept that it refers back to the classic militaria. And so, like I said, multiple ways to make a patch happen and pretty interesting to do, right? So, I really like that. We have a couple comments here. One, I'll just bring one up here. Everybody's saying hi to each other, which I love. Barb says, I like the double satin stacked edge, very clean looking. Yeah, totally. It's a good clean looking edge too. I will say though, the cleanliness, the cleanness, the sharpness, crispness of that edge, a lot of that has to do with refining your patch production method. I don't like hot cut for that, cutting them out of a span most of the time, especially if the material, if you're a good cutter, you're good at it, that material doesn't really look that bad most of the time. But I often like to have something soluble. I will end my material a little further inside. I'll have the inset a little deeper than some folks and have that fabric or the thread wrapping around the edge. The only thing to worry about, if you go too far on that, then you've got loose thread that really isn't holding onto anything. We don't have anything inside of it that's holding it up all that much. But with underlays and everything as they are, you can kind of get a pretty nice edge out of that. Really, water soluble for me has been the way to get the cleanest edge on patches. A lot of people cut them out of things or cut them even out of like no-show mesh or like Weblon stabilizers and heat fuse the edges. That's fine too. Sometimes they can look very clean, sometimes less. Depends on the shape that you're working on and how much time you spend cleaning up that edge. For me, I was always okay with, especially making those wardrobe pieces for TV's movies. Unless they needed them same day, I would use the water soluble method because I don't have to pay attention once they're rinsed out. They just have to dry. If I have enough time to dry them or press them flat or anything that I need to do after the fact, then I don't mind using the water soluble edge because it really melts the entirety of the stabilizer away. Though I am going to say, since then, the development of like the polyolefin films, the thick plastic films that also heat away. So it's a plastic film that I tear it away, and then I can use a little bit of heat around the edge and it shrinks up and kind of melts. That stuff's fantastic. So if you look at like easy badge films that are thick, they have some texture to them. You'll see they have a dotted texture. They look thick and they heat away at the edge. That's some pretty good stuff too, and I've really enjoyed it. But I thought I'd show you a couple more technique things too. The great thing these days, because I like I said, I kind of wanted to just love on the Embroidered stuff a little bit because we do have that edge. I did show you guys the gallery piece of that one edge as well, and I thought I'll probably bring that up one more time to just give you a shot at that. I will say we do at least luckily have some of these kind of tools now, and these tools were not available back in the day. But I really do love kind of the new Hamlin edge that I showed you. And I'm going to bring that back up so we can see it in the hoop and after the fact. In the hoop, here is that faux marrowed edge being stitched. As we can see, has that nice texture, the nice little hooks that are on the inside. Love that stuff. Like I said, other people make these as well. Fuller makes a good one. The Fuller Embroidery Works makes a good one. He does those shapes that you can pre-purchase. If you want to do super custom shapes like some of the stuff I was doing, then I either using the wrap on Merrily to do just a contour, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute, or drawing your own in Stitch Artist 3 lets you do your own special shapes, whatever it is you want to do, like some of those crazy insets I showed you on some of my military patches or free-floating patches might be different. But I love that it can look like this on the machine, and once we rinse it out, we just get this super clean, crispy edge. Like I said, lovely, crispy edge, and that's with basic settings. The one thing to remind you about this one, I just wanted to show you, this patch itself is made entirely out of thread. So this one was done with multiple layers of underlayment, and it's stitched over in thread. So all of the blue that you're seeing back here, this is all thread. It's many more stitches by far than the fabric patches you saw earlier. These patches are also made entirely out of thread on substrate, and that was done intentionally because I needed those colors and couldn't get the patch material. This one was my original thing I had to do, which is I sublimated the color onto white material to get that patch material color for them. But then I showed them this, the concept of these thread only patches as a potential way to do that. Merrily does those automatically. As a matter of fact, this is all in one object. The one done for the New Hamlin Police is one object that is done automatically. It's just a setting in the Edge tool. But these that I did for the San Antonio Police, these were manually built out of a stack of fills. So it's multiple fill stitch setups, edge runs, and a top stitch that were used to make that quote unquote fabric. Whereas this one was done with the Merrily style tool, the Edge tool from Stitch Artist 3. And that's done interactively as a setting. So you pretty much just have your shape. You tell it, "Yup, I want to fill it with thread," and it does so. Whereas these are done, this is another of those opportunities just to show you. This is a pre-made patch that I stuck it down on a sticky stabilizer, and these were already there as these squares, and I stitched this design of mine, the ALVB design, Ars Longa Vita Brevis design that I made. This is actually part of a series of designs, and I stitched this on after the fact. And the other things interesting about this, we have a shiny polyester thread on the left and a matte finish polyester on the right to give it that really sharp white. So kind of interesting different ways we can go about it. But like I said, it's cool to get that edge, and I just love that stuff. The wash away edge is really nice. We can see on the Harvest Heroes, even on that early version that just has the satin edge. I mean, satin doesn't have as much kind of visual texture. I really do like the foam marrow, but you can see that you get a really nice clean edge from that rinse away method, and it's kind of cool stuff. But like I said, I really just wanted to kind of love on all these different patch processes and say they're all possible for you guys to do. It's all kind of fun stuff to look at. Let's take a look at this real quick. We can see just a couple of different things that I thought were interesting. Certainly, you can now see what I'm talking about with the Merrily style stitch that's here in comparison to this satin edge. Satin clean edge is totally fine. I really do love the marrowed edge, and I kind of showed you what that's going to look like. But it's a very similar structure. If we get over to here, we're still doing our placement and tack lines that are there. The tack line is further inside the material. Then we have all of the central material that we're running, all the central design area that runs, and then we have the underlay and the built-up edge. So Merrily does give you very much like that doubled satin, the built-up edge that gives it some body to that edge, and then we run the patented Merrily stitch. So we have this Merrily stitch that goes on that has that entire setup going on. Then same kind of thing here. In this case, we got our placement and our tack lines. Then I have our text, and then we finish up with the edge building stitches that I talked about earlier, and then the final faux marrow stitch. And as you can see, this was automatically handled. That cornering is completely automatic. If we look at the actual shape there, I did this shape from a trace of the stitches, so it's not a very clean shape. But if we look at the shape here, it's a very simple shape, and I didn't have to do anything to handle all those corners. That was done automatically, and so that's not the same over here. On the satin edge, that was also automatic cornering, but I don't know anything except for Stitch Artist 3 that does automatic cornering in the faux marrow stitches. So if that's important to you, that might be a thing you have to look at. But it really depends on what you're working on. Like I said, lots of cool stuff. I've applied that same stitch type to some of my older patches just to play with it. Here's a USAF patch that I did for 58 Special Operations Wing. And this one, I've also used that Merrily stitch, and you can see that it's absolutely that edge is really handling those corners pretty well by itself, because that's another very simple shape. If we look at the actual shape that's there, really simple, doesn't have a lot else going on with it. So you didn't have to draw all this extra stuff. Got all our seed bombers or other stuff here, but we have a couple different ones I wanted to get a chance to show you just in a moment while we're finishing up here. The new Hamlin badge, this is the badge that you were looking at in the hoop there. Other interesting things that are great when we have tools to do it. If you're using embroidered text, in this case, these are straight out of the Merrily package. This is Merrily Air. I decided to use the Air Force font because I just liked it better. So that's Merrily Air. But what you can see here, if we looked at that really closely, I'm sure you noticed that font doesn't look warped over here, but suddenly it warps automatically. That's using an envelope. This piece that's here, that is actually in the design. There is an envelope built into the design so that you can do these envelopes and these baselines. You see those two baselines that are there. It allows you to track text specifically in the shape. This is one of the stock shapes that comes with Merrily, and allows you to make patches like this that have the doubled line. And you just type this out, and it automatically warps in with the BX fonts. If you have essentials, you can use that with stitch-based fonts. In this case, these are object-based fonts here, so we can do things like change order. We can change stitch types and underlay stuff like that in these fonts in the stitch menus here. But that's all stuff that we can do because we have that there. In order to track that, these letters are just given these specific names so that they match specifically to these envelopes that are placed inside of that border. So in the Merrily set, you can pick up this design, and this design will have these preset lines and envelopes in it that let you do the text really simply. But you can also do your custom stuff like I showed you guys. The other thing I want to show you really quickly, just because it's a cool tool we have and I like to look at it, is we can do page wraps as well. We can do that automatically. So here's just a piece of text in a font that I created called Hard Cider. And I really like this font, but let's just say we had something in this text and we want to make a patch out of it, and you actually have access to the Merrily software. The cool thing is we have a couple of things we can do under our utilities. We can add a patch edge, and we can see here we have rectangle, circle, or page wrap. We add a rectangle, adds a rectangle around the whole design. Actually, I had this other material here. I have an old outline left, so let me delete that out. But if we grab this piece here again, take our outlines out. We don't want any of the outline stuff. Just have our letters. Go to our utility here, add a patch edge. We get a rectangle. We can add a patch edge depending on what we have in our piece here. We got some extra input here, but let's go ahead and drop we can do circles. But then what I really want to do is the page wrap. Page wrap makes that automatic. So if I have that piece and I drop that page wrap on there, it immediately gives me this patch. We have the patch edge. If we want to go interactive, we can either show a fabric preview of what would be there if we're using fabrics, or if we want to create it with the fill, we can use a fill. And this is actually creating that multi-layer fill that makes it entirely out of thread, like I showed you guys before. It makes these underlays that hold up very much like a lace, and then a top stitch. And then we throw down our edges. So that's another option that we have here. Or we can do this with any manner of fabrics. And in fact, you can do it with a light fill. So that if we had a fabric behind this, we could have a fabric and a 50% fill, so that we just get fill texture on top of a fabric that we're wanting to add to the piece. So there's all these different options, and it's automated. And like I said before, if you want your patch edge second, we could actually copy paste and do the different setups. So we had just our placement on one side and just our edge on the other side. And the cool thing is this really is automatic. To show you that it is not entirely based on anything else, I can grab a different font here. There's multiple other fonts that I could use, but let's just keep another font that I've played with myself here, and give you kind of a concept of what these things look like. So if we're working on these fonts, we can go ahead and grab some other font that's here. We'll go ahead and do the Merrily Army font here and say, here's our hard cider piece. And if we wanted a patch that goes around that specifically, we can go ahead and say add patch edge, give yourself a page wrap, and it'll wrap it exactly to whatever shape that's there. And this also includes any other stitches that are there. You can do this with any stitches, any design, and make an immediate patch. But these are tools that weren't there before, right? These are tools that we didn't have, and I just thought something that's interesting that you can now do. It's something that's cool. Even with this offset piece like we have it here, we have the opportunity to go ahead and create things like I said, like that page wrap, which I really do love as a patch border. We can do a contour that comes off of that edge, and that's something that's done automatically. But a lot of the stuff you're going to do it manually. You're going to have that inspiration like I did. You're going to think, hey, I like the militaria. I like the look of that stuff. I want to make my own shapes. Well, you can do that in Stitch Artist 3 as well. But like I said, if you want to do an edged patch like we see over here on the other side, if you just want to make a satin edge patch, that is very similar to applique. If you get inspired, think about it. Do your research. Think about some shapes, think about some themes, and you can make whatever you like, because really patches and applique are very close sisters. And if you understand how they're put together, you just have to know your insets, how did your placements, how did your cuts, your tack downs, and what order to put them in. And patches really aren't that mysterious. It's a little bit of materials. It's a little bit of inspiration. It's being careful with your sequencing. It's being careful with your placement of your edges. And like I said, go back to episodes 11 and 12. I will probably go and do a new episode soon, because I would like to do a run through of multiple methods and show a little bit more of that. I think that's on the horizon for me, because people have been asking me, hey, can you literally show us washing out a patch? Can you literally show us some of that stuff? So that might be coming, not probably immediately, but something I've been wanting to do. And if you're lucky enough to have other tools that do some automation, it does make it easier. You have Stitch Artist 3, you can do the foam narrowing really easily. If you don't, inspect the motif method. Motif method is possible just where it breaks around corners. You may have to make multiple shapes and kind of tuck things in and move your individual motifs to make them look good. Or get somebody like Jeff Fuller to make something cool. You can do that. Jan Donnelly asks, is page wrap in Merrily? Yes, that's in Merrily. That's not Stitch Artist 3, that's Merrily. Merrily does a rectangle wrap, a circle wrap, and a page wrap. Unfortunately, my font had something that was on there. I have an old version of that font on there that had something hanging down that was causing some of the spacing to get weird. But as you saw, the page wrap version was going quite well. The rectangle was a little off-centered, but I think that's me. Something is weird on my font right there. So that's something where I think if I were a little more careful with my font choice there, instead of using one of my old fun fonts that I hadn't really finished out, I probably would have been a lot nicer look. But, like I said, that's in Merrily. That is not in Stitch Artist 3. If you have Stitch Artist 3, what that lets you do is take any shape you've drawn and add that edge stitch type, which we call it a stitch type, but the edge stitch type includes the cut lines, the tack downs, building a patch from thread, or using the half density fill, texturing fill over top of fabric. All of that's included in that one object. So look at what the object does. Go check out the Merrily supplemental PDF as well if you want to see what other kinds of things you can learn about patches there. But yeah, the edge style really has a lot more to it. It's a full tool. So we call it a stitch type, and it looks like a stitch type in your setup, in your tools. But that stitch type actually is a suite of settings and tools that allow you to create patches. And like I said, it's not that you can't create patches in any software. In fact, I have created patches in most of the softwares I've used, not my oldest one, because I wasn't creating patches back in the days of QDT on DOS. But the tool difference is this. You can create patches individually very easily with straight stitch, zigzags, any sort of column for your edge for satins. Or if you want to add textures, what a lot of people do is they will do a satin stitch edge and then put a chain stitch on the inside edge to give themselves a little bit of that texture. It's kind of cool. But if we have the automated tools, you can get things like the faux marrow stitch with the automatic cornering. You can get the automatic generation of the stitch-based patch without making multiple layers of fill. When you're building that, as you saw it running, there are 3 layers of support fill as well as a top layer of fill. And there's some work to be done there that just abstracts, just takes it away. You don't have to do that non-creative work of copying, pasting, setting, changing each one of those fill objects. And if down the road you decide to change the shape of that fill object a little bit, let me tell you from experience, if you have to do that on 3 or more fills, now what we're doing is like copying settings from each fill and having to replace and copy and paste 4 copies of that fill on top of each other and change all the settings and entry and exit points in order to get them exactly how I want them. If I change the outside edge, like if I change the shape of that edge, I now have really, instead of maybe 1 or 2 edge material, edge stitch objects, I now have 4 stacks of fill and at least 1 border and a tack down stitch and a placement stitch. And all of those shapes now have to change. So that's why the automation is good. What I always say is I don't like auto digitizing because it takes away your creative impetus. It takes away that part of the creativity for you. But I very much like things that eliminate doldrum, dull work, the kind of stuff where we're just dragging ourselves through copying and pasting and changing and messing with everything. Those kind of works, I'm fully happy to leave alone. I don't really want to do that work. Now, one thing I'm going to show real quick, because I had a bad showing earlier because I actually chose a bad file, I'm going to show you again. I've converted that hard cider text over to just stitches. It doesn't have what was there in my original vector art, which I messed this up. And if we want to look at that patch edge again, we go to utility here. We can see we have add patch edge. You want to add a rectangle? Boom, rectangle. There we go. No big deal. We can also work on our corners on that. We can actually round less or more or inset. And this is all based on the initial patch edge that I did. So that's Merrily. Then we go back, Merrily plus I have Stitch Artist, so I get that extra shape tool. But in Merrily, we have all these other tools here. But we can create that rectangle. So the rectangle is an option. Also, if we have this piece right here, let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to dump this guy out. So here's our initial letters piece again, and this is in stitches. So if we look at this piece, this is no longer object. So you can also imagine if you brought in a DST file of any logo you've ever done, you can wrap any logo you've ever done, any piece you ever used. But we go to our utility menu again. We can go to add a patch edge to this. We add a circle, and it's going to place that circle and we can go ahead and size that and get it perfect, but it centers it on the design exactly. So we get that placed in. And that's in Merrily without having any Stitch Artist stuff. Or we go to add patch edge and get our page wrap. And then you see the cool wrap that we had from before where we can wrap that edge around automatically. And we get things like this automatic cornering with the nice overlaps, this automatic kind of mitering and lapping into these corners over here. And that's all part of the Merrily tool. Since Jan was asking, is page wrap part of Merrily? Absolutely. So are the, like I said, so is that other automated stuff you saw, including adding that rectangle. So that's something that you can do very, very simply in Merrily. But if you're like me and you want to do your own fun shapes, you want to make shapes like this and you want to be able to entirely change them, well, that's something that you're only going to get from Stitch Artist. So if you suddenly want to make something really different, really crazy, and you want to edit that shape yourself, well, if you have Stitch Artist, you have the ability to make that shape anything you want and to get as wild as you want to get with it. And we're going to see that automatic cornering and the rest is going to handle how this stitch changes, how that Merrily stitch changes up into the corners. As you can see, it changes that cornering. It makes its own miters. It does whatever you need it to do with whatever shape you got. So those are the things with Stitch Art specifically. But like I said, auto cornering is available in satin stitches for a lot of different packages. So for those, then you can do things like work on this kind of stuff. This is actually not in this software. This is an old Wilcom piece that I did. And in Wilcom, if we look at this piece real quick, you can see that there is an auto corner here on the satin stitch. And sometimes you don't have to do, like, I didn't have to cut this into two pieces. This auto cornering was done. This mitering was done on a satin column, and that was automatic. So that's it's not that you can't get automatic cornering anywhere else. It is that automatic cornering and programmatic generation of the Marrow style foam Marrow stitch. That's not going to be something you're going to see anywhere else, and that's something you're going to get working with Stitch Artist 3. Specifically, though, in our existing shapes in Merrily, absolutely it does it. And when we do things like doing that wrap, if we go over to utility and get our page wrap on, that is absolutely handled automatically. So you're not going over here and changing these shapes. Though, if you're someone who does have, like I said, you do have Stitch Artist, if that's something you've got and you want to work on it, well, after the fact, I can certainly make this back into an object in Stitch Artist if I happen to have Stitch Artist 3, and I can work on that shape again if I want to. So that is something you can do, but it's not something you have to do if you're doing it automatically and just want to get a wrap. All right, without doing any more software specific stuff, let's just go over kind of the points real fast and get done. And this wasn't a fast show. I got too excited talking about all the cool stuff, guys. Like I said, it was something I got to work on with me and Brian, and it was something that I was real proud of. So I just like to show that stuff once in a while. Usually I stay software agnostic, but that stuff is so much fun and allowed me to do some really cool versions of patches that I really got excited about. So for the Garden Guerilla patches, like I said, originally patch style designs. If you want to grab them for yourself, you like these patch designs, they are available since everybody asks. Head over to theonlystitch.com. You'll find the Garden Guerilla patch design, the Harvest Heroes design, and the Seed Bomber design. If you know somebody who is a gardener and would like some hardcore patches run on their design or on their shoulders, go ahead. But these are embroidery style designs, not patches. If that's something anybody's super interested in, let me know. Maybe I'll throw them up on the website eventually in true patch layouts so that you can do them yourself. But you can get those. The thing that's interesting about these pieces are this. Not only just the technicality of them, but this inspiration, right? Inspiration. How do we get inspiration? And this is how we do it. For me, certainly there's some R&D, but you start out with what is it that you're doing? You're like, okay, guerrilla gardening, what is it? It's kind of paramilitary. It's kind of green. It's got some leaves. It's got some uniforms. It sounds like something that works with a uniform. Let's try that out. And just let your mind roll with it. Go, what would that be like if there were an organization of gardeners who all wore these patches on their shoulders? And even though it's goofy, I just let my head go with it. I'm like, all right, this is what the different divisions would be, and this is what the patches would be. Let your fantasy world out, right? Build that fantasy world up. And when you get that inspiration, go ahead, go to do R&D. So I'm looking up militaria. What kind of military patches are there? Oh, hey, check it out. This Army unit, this Army aviation unit has these really cool pieces that work well with my concept. It works with the theme, the tools that I'm going on. But then I'm going to change the colors and have these nice greens, but maybe I'll subdue them just a little bit so they look like a subdued military patch, but then let the greens be a little vibrant because we're talking about gardening and plants. And then we do this. We remix and match up. What could we do with a patch that looks like this, that has rockers like this other type of patch that we worked with, that has this kind of layout? Well, we add individual shapes. We mash things together. Military stuff plus gardening. And then we say, all right, hey, put the mashup even further out there. What are iconic patches? triple rocker biker patches plus shoulder patches. Plus, I've seen award patches or merit patches in different kinds of groups that might have tags or dates. So I love that idea of that patch set. Mash all that together, let it stew, and make something new out of it. Go for your military ed. Look up patch history. There are so many historical souvenir military merit badge patches out there being sold on eBay, being shown in museums. You have the benefit of this day. This is 2023 and the internet is your friend. But get inspiration, don't rip off. Do the remix and mashup. Take notes. What's a cool color scheme? What's a cool object? What is a nice shape? And put them together to make something new. Then once you get there, think about your method. Think about how it's going to work. And do I want certain things? Do I want foam arrowing? Do I want enveloping so I can have cool warped text? Or do I want to go perfect edge and do a satin edge? Do I like the texture? Do I like the smoothness? What is it that I want? What am I trying to evoke? And then get out there and sketch a little bit. No one has to see your drawing. It can look horrible. Trust me, my original looks horrible. In fact, I would argue that my first design iteration where I tried to kind of show somebody what I wanted to do, I think this looks horrible. This is boring. This looks like a corporate logo for like the red shovel gardening people who come around to do your stuff. Like, this does not look great. It looks like I mashed up the Paul Rand UPS logo from way back when with part of a military logo and didn't really do much effort. So honestly, realize that there are different versions that are going to happen and that your sketch to embroidery process can be anything from a napkin with some shapes to a fully rendered vector to an airbrushed painting, if that's how you work best. And then scan that in and draw and get into it and work in the thread. Remember that some of that stuff, like the shading I showed you in the Seed Bomber piece, really some of that stuff is done in the thread. I've done the earlier episodes on working in, and when we're talking about that kind of stuff where you're working into the thread, where you're working with the materials, sometimes doing shading like this is really best done and almost only done once we get into the embroidery software, so that we can look and say, here's my stitch angle and I want some of these lines to sink in. Well, I'm going to run them at the same angle as my curved fill so I can figure that out. Or how am I going to figure out all these textures to make them look the way I want them to? When we're dealing with textures and shadows and highlights, a lot of that's done in the thread, and it doesn't make sense necessarily to note every little bit about that in our art. Or even if we do the art, realize that by the time you get to the thread, by the time you get to digitizing, you're going to make little cuts and changes and alterations to angles and shapes, not only for pull compensation and push compensation, but to do the artistic textural things you want to do. All right, so I know I rambled on forever and showed you 3 patches. I'm probably going to do more of these design breakdowns, because even if they're not always the top ones that are asked for, people come back and watch these later and ask me questions. I've got a bunch of these where they come into my inbox, they come to my website much later down the road and say, I want to do something similar to that piece. Can we talk about a technique? And absolutely, you can send me questions. But that's something where I do think it's valuable. Like I said, you want to go get them for yourself. I'm definitely not trying to sell them. I don't make a ton of money over there, but hey, you want them at theonlystitch.com, let me know. I can always give you a percentage off or something. I didn't set one up ahead of time, but if you desperately want it. But realize that there are all manner of methods to do machine embroidered edge patches, and you should try it out. They're worthwhile. Soluble stabilizers are awesome. Plastic methods, super easy if it's not as clean. Post cut or heat cut is possible. If you have a soldering iron you don't care about, or a wood burning tool, you too can become a heat cutter of patches if you want to practice at it. But ultimately, this is open to you. And what I really think is important about all of this is to let your mind go, let that inspiration come to you, let yourself play in this space, and you can teach yourself something on a piece that's important to you and learn new technique. But like I said, get inspiration, get inspired, let your mind wander wild for a little bit. And you never know, because pieces like that, pieces that I did for myself, really translated down the road to all that stuff I did for Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and Night Shift and Preacher and all those movies and the stuff that people tend to look at and go, oh, that's so cool. The genesis of all of that is because I wanted to learn and be able to do that stuff, and I wanted to get better at patch design. Also, I designed a massive chunk of all the stuff for like the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department. And though a lot of that comes from their original art as well, my knowledge of patch design, of getting things to fit, of arcing things, of doing the kind of text that is the right size, of working with those edges and layouts and borders and making them just so, comes partially from things like this. If you want to stretch your wings and you don't want to have the accountability of somebody else's work or somebody else's order waiting for that, be proactive, get out there, get inspiration, and make something for yourself. It's just a great way to go about it. So, all right, folks, gonna head on out. I think it's something interesting to do. I welcome you to do patches. If you do them, show me later. Otherwise, let me know what you want to see later. Let me know what's coming up. What are the questions that are getting to you? What do you need for inspiration? How can I help you get to the embroidery you want? And how can I help you wear your heart on your sleeve and help your customers do the same? All right, folks, have a great weekend. If you're in the US, like I said, Memorial Day weekend is important and kind of a very serious holiday, but enjoy your weekend. And definitely, much respect to all the people who have gone before and who are in the service. But I want you guys to all take care of yourselves and have a wonderful weekend. Have some time, have a break, and let your mind free for a while. Get inspired. And I can't wait to help you get that inspiration out into the thread next week.